Welcome back to a short video series I am doing exploring JavaScript and how it handles object-oriented programming. In this video, we're going to be covering constructors with prototypes. This video picks up where we left off with at the end of the video covering the factory function object creation pattern, and we can see here our hit song factory function, and we're going to start by turning this into a constructor function. Before we do that, let's remind ourselves some of the disadvantages of working with the factory function object creation pattern. If we look at our resulting object that we created with our hit song factory function, it has its own unique copy of all the behaviors in it that are a result of returning this object out of the factory function. So as many hit songs are created, they each have their own method, and that can be burdensome on performance with all those individual instances of the method loaded into memory for each of those resulting objects. Also, there was no connection. So we have our resulting hit songs that were all created, but there was no way to link our resulting hit songs back to the function that created it. So this object here, its hidden prototype reference, doesn't point back to hit song. If we would type in partyrock.constructor and look at the constructor property, it's not going to reference hit song. If we do instance of and we do party rock instance of hit song, it's not going to connect back. So those are the two main disadvantages. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into constructors and discuss why it might be a little more advantageous to use a constructor function. We're going to start by taking our factory function syntax here, and we're going to turn this syntax into something that we can use with a constructor function. Here we have rewritten our factory function to be used like a constructor function, and you'll notice a couple differences. The naming convention for constructor functions or constructors, we capitalize the first letter, and you'll also see we don't have an explicit return in the body of our constructor function itself. We just have a bunch of lines, we just have a bunch of expressions here. And then you'll also notice the this keyword. I'm not going to go on a deep dive into the this keyword. That's for another video. There's a lot of other resources that you can look into to kind of learn about the nuances of the this keyword. But let's just cover a couple things real quick. If we were to invoke this function, hit song down here without anything else, just invoke the function, then in this context, this would be referring to the global object, or if you're in the browser, it would be referring to the window object, which if you were just to invoke that function and try to access the title or date created property, they would not exist and you would get undefined. But we don't get that, and we'll go through why in just a bit. But we have our party rock, and we're using the new JavaScript new keyword in our hit song constructor, passing our arguments to get a new object that we have down here, party rock. So we're trying to do the same thing, right? We're building off of our knowledge of the factory functions, and so we have our party rock object down here, and we log the value at title, and we invoke our fatbeat function, which returns the string, and we see our expected values down here when we log. So we know that we successfully created this. And let's just think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the factory function again real quick. Each object has its own copy of all of the methods, and there's no connection back to our creating our factory function. So let's look at this constructor and take those two kind of disadvantages in mind. And let's look first to see if our object here has its own unique copies of our methods down here. And we see that Party Rock does indeed own both of these properties, true and true. And, well, that's not an advantage. Well, let's see about the other thing. Can we connect Party Rock back to hit song? Well, we use our instance of operator, Party Song, or Party Rock instance of hit song, true. Party Rock.constructor, what function constructed this Party Rock object? Hit song. All right, well, that's an improvement at least. Let's see if we can work on the other piece there. And to do that, we're going to go back and look at something we glossed over, and the new keyword. And I'm going to give you a hint here. This get prototype of Party Rock. So we're going to look at the prototype of this. HitSong.prototype. All right, so let's update our diagram. We know that this is true. Let's update our diagram to connect these two objects. So we've updated our diagram to include our known relationships here. Party Rock, the hidden prototype reference on Party Rock points to the prototype, HitSong.prototype object. And we see that the constructor for Party Rock points back to hit song. So that's one of our disadvantages of the factory function that's been taken care of. And before we move on, let's look at this. Let's just talk about the instance of real quick. So instance of, let's say this Party Rock constructor is hit song. But let's say that we want to change this. We say, well, let's make this a little more specific. We want Party Rock to be constructed by dance hit instead of hit song. So here we made up a temporary and fictional constructor called dance hit song, and we look at Party Rock instance of hit song. That's true. We see Party Rock.constructor is hit song. We reassign this value that's at Party Rock.constructor, which we know is this value here, and we reassign that to the value at dancehitsong.prototype.constructor. And then we log our Party Rock.constructor again, and we see that it has successfully been changed to dance hit song. Well, that should mean Party Rock is not an instance of hit song anymore, but it should be an instance of dance song. So let's take a look at that. Oh, it is still an instance of hit song. So this is kind of getting off of the happy path, if you will, a little bit. It's you can reassign this constructor value, and just know that these work differently. So instance of is actually looking up the prototypal chain. So you're asking this operator to see if this hit song is in the prototypal chain of this object, and we see that we haven't done anything with this hidden prototype reference. It's still pointing back to HitSong.prototype, and so JavaScript will tell you the instance of Party Rock is still in HitSong. And so you can also see, like if we did Party Rock instance of, well, here, let's just do it real quick. If we look and see that Party Rock is also an instance of object, we can see that that's true, because we know that object lives up above hit song here. We've gone through some of those relationships already. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and go back to discussing this new JavaScript keyword. In examining what the new keyword does, let's break it down step by step. So we have this line, let party rock, this variable, be assigned, let that equal what's going on over here. So we can just think of this as hit song, right? This is this function up here getting invoked. But what does the new keyword do? That's these steps right here. New creates an entirely new object. So let's get that up over in our diagram. Okay, then new, invoking or using a new keyword, sets the constructor.prototype as the prototype for the new object. Well, what does that mean? What's the prototype of this object? How do we discover that? Well, we look at the hidden prototype reference, right? So the new keyword is going to set that hidden prototype reference of this new object here to point back to this constructor, which in this case is hitSong.prototype. Okay, now it sets the execution context, the this keyword, for the function, we have that up here, to point to this new object. And it invokes the function. So when new invokes this function, at that moment the this keyword has the execution context of the new object down here. So this new object dot title, if we go line by line, new object dot title equals title, which is the value passed in to our function here. So let's just add that in. Next line, we have date created set to the value passed in for the parameter date. Next, we have generic lyrics defined as a function that returns this string, and so on for the other methods. So new created the new object, it set the hidden prototype reference to point back to the constructor.prototype value. It set the execution context, we can think of it like the this keyword, and it invoked the function with that execution context, and we walk through that. And lastly, it returns this new object unless the function returns another object. I'll come right back to that. So we return that new object right here, and that new object gets assigned to Party Rock. Okay, so we walked through this new keyword step by step, and we see how we end up with our Party Rock object here at the end. That last line, the unless the function returned another object, so if you were to, within the function body of hitSong, return a just a string or a primitive value, any primitive value, then the new keyword ignores that and it just returns this new object. But if you explicitly return an object from this function, then new will discard the empty object that it created, or if it had used the this keyword and we had title, date created, all of these in there, if we had instead come down here and returned a different object here, then the new keyword would disregard all the work it had already done with this new object, and it would just take the explicitly returned object instead. And so then Party Rock would end up being this new empty object. But we're not going to dive into that. I don't want to confuse things too much. So now we saw where Party Rock came from. Well, let's use this knowledge to our advantage. And let's still continue down the path of trying to address some of the disadvantages of the factory function, and we can see that Party Rock still has all of its own methods here. So if we create, and you know what, let's go ahead and do that. Let's create our other hit song here, and we can see that it will also have its own copy of all of these methods as well. Okay, so our new keyword hasn't changed. It still walks through all of those 5 steps that we just went through with Party Rock, and so we should end up with another object, very similar manner, and instance of Party Rock. That should still be hit song. Lean On was also created with our constructor function hit song, so it should also ring true here. This Party Rock has own property fat beat, and Lean On has own property fat beat. So all of these things should be true when we run this, and they are. Okay, so all of this is true, and so we're still left with our liability here. But we know, we have been discussing over and over the prototypal nature of JavaScript and what it does. So what can we do to improve our redundancy here? Instead of having multiple copies of these methods, where can we put these methods that would still be available for this Lean On object, that would still be available for Party Rock without having their own unique copies down here and cluttering up our memory? So up here we have reassigned all of our methods. We've taken them out of our hit song constructor, and instead you can see our hit song.prototype. We're defining our method within this hit song.prototype object over here. And so when we come down here, these should all be false. Party Rock has own property, all of these methods, and then when we log the value of each of these methods that they each return, we should still be able to access these because of the prototypal nature of JavaScript. And we do. Party Rock doesn't have any of those methods, and yet we're still able to access these methods on the Party Rock object because JavaScript isn't finding them here. And you know what? Let's just update our diagram to reflect that. There, we've updated our diagram to reflect that when JavaScript looks for those methods here on Party Rock, using this dot notation syntax, is looking on Party Rock, it doesn't find it there. It uses the hidden prototype reference, and it finds them up the prototypal chain in hit song, because that's where we put these methods. And we can do the same thing for Lean On. Here we've rewritten with our Lean On object instead. So when we run this, it should result in the same thing. Lean On doesn't own any of those methods, but it can still access them because they're in the prototype object. And this is the basics of the constructor with prototype object creation pattern. For the sake of continuity, I'll go ahead and I'll just finish showing all of this, the full diagram here with the code to back up the relationships. And we see that Party Rock, Lean On objects go up the prototypal chain to hit song.prototype. Hit song.prototype goes up the chain to object.prototype. And object.prototype ends with null. So we can look at our hit song function object itself, look at its hidden prototype reference, get the prototype of that, and that equals function.prototype, this object here. We look at function.prototype and we go up the chain, and that leads us back to object.prototype, which again ends in null, and all of these things are true down here. Alright, this is great. It gives us a good idea of what working with constructors and prototypes, how it works. But out in the wild, JavaScript's probably not going to be this simple. The problems that we work on aren't just going to be reduced down to this single or double layer. There's probably a lot more intricacies, and so we should talk about subtypes. And I briefly referenced this when talking about the disadvantages of the factory function creation pattern, and we talked about, let's say we didn't want a hit song, but let's say we wanted different genres. So maybe we have a dance hit song and we have a rock hit song, and there's different characteristics. Instead of a catchy hook, maybe in the rock we want a lyrical hook, or we need to have a solid guitar riff in there. Okay, so let's talk about subtyping, and let's build up to this point using our code and the constructor prototype creation pattern. Okay, so as a music executive, you've determined you just have your hit song here. We know that every hit song is going to have these generic lyrics. You can't be too edgy if you want to sell to the masses. So let's keep our generic lyrics function up here at the top. We've cleared everything out. We know we're going to just assume by this point these hidden prototype references, all these objects have them. For simplicity, we'll just keep marching. And let's go ahead and get our dance hit constructor function in here as well and flesh that out. Alright, so we have our dance hit song constructor back up here. We have our object that we're creating with a new keyword and the dance hit song constructor, and we're going to try to log all these values in here. Take a moment if you need to, pause the video and kind of get in your mind what you think this is going to log down here. And an error. Well, where's this error coming from? Well, if we look at our code here, we actually have nothing connecting this dance hit song back up to hit song. Okay, so this connection doesn't exist right now. Alright, well, let's go ahead and let's fix our code then. Let's try to connect dance hit song up the chain to hit. Okay, so I've added in this line right here, dance hit song.prototype, and we're using object.create, which is going to create a new object and use the argument passed in as the prototype object, which is what we want. So we want hitSong.prototype to be the prototype of something down the chain, an object that we're creating, and that is what we're going to set as this dance hit song.prototype object. So that should do the trick, right? It should connect to our chain. Okay, so let's run our code again. Ooh, all right. Well, another error, but this one's slightly different. If we go up, we see that generic lyrics is not a function. So it ran into this and we hit a problem because we weren't connected. Well, this time generic lyrics up here in hitSong didn't give us an error. Instead, we had a problem with fat beat. Okay, well, why is that? We'll look at where we created our prototype. So we defined our constructor dance hit song. Then we added in these functions, fat beat and catchy hook. But then we took this object that had these and we got rid of it. We aren't using that anymore. Instead, we have a new object. So in essence, we have just an empty, these pieces right here are gone, and we're just looking up the chain. So generic lyrics didn't give us an error. We came down here and we see that fat beat, catchy hook, they're not anywhere in the chain here. Alright, well, let's go ahead and fix this then. So now we have moved our line of code that connects this dance hit song constructor up the chain to hit song. We move this line just underneath where we create our constructor function. So then that sets the prototype object, connects it up to hitSong.prototype. Then we add our methods, our functionality to dance hit song, and then we create our new object. So this all should work, right? Well, we see down here our methods, those are all lined up. We can access generic lyrics in this lean on. We can access up the chain in hit song. We can access fat beat and catchy hook up the chain, which are in dance hit song, but our title and date created aren't coming through. Well, let's look at how we defined and how we called. So right here we're using this lean on, and we're passing in these arguments to dance hit song. Well, let's look at our dance hit song function. Something's wrong there, right? So let's fix that. So now we have added this call to our hit song constructor. The call method uses the this keyword so that we can preserve our connection when we use new down here. So let's just walk through this real quick. So we have new. It's going up to dance hit song. We have our string and number value passed in. So we go up to dance hit song. New creates a new object. It sets that new object as the execution context, and the this keyword now refers to that empty object. And so we see right here, this is referring to that empty object which call uses as the execution context when it runs hit song. So we are passing the title and the date, our string and our number in. Call also uses these as the parameters or the arguments it passes through into the function it's calling. We go up here to hit song, so now we have our string and our number passed into the hit song constructor. We know that this was set by the new keyword to the new object. So now we have the new object dot title being assigned to the value passed in, which was passed in into dance hit song, which we originally have down here when we're calling our dance hit song. So that's how all of these values trickle up the chain, and we can see down here when we go to log everything, lean on dot title dot created, we have all of our methods. We can see that they're kind of sprinkled around in different spots here, and yet whenever we just use this kind of simple object and we have the property that we're accessing, it works. Right now everything looks good, right? We have all of our values and our behaviors passing down our inheritance chain here, but we're actually still not quite getting all the pieces in place, and it has to do with the constructor property. So let's look at those real quick. Alright, so over here this is what we should have, but if we log our values out, we can see that everything is pointing back up to hit song. Well, why is that? Let's look at how we created our objects here. So we defined our original constructor hit song. We have our hit song prototype that we added our behaviors to. Then we created our dance hit song constructor. And right here, when we assign this dance hit song dot prototype, we're creating an object and we're using this as its prototype. So what does that object? Well, if we look at that object and we look at dance hit song dot prototype and see if it has its own property of constructor, it's false. So this actually doesn't exist here. Instead, when we are going to log our values here, JavaScript looks for dance hit song dot prototype dot constructor. It doesn't find it there, and it goes up the prototypal chain using the hidden prototype reference, and it finds it here. That's the same thing with lean on. It looks for constructor, doesn't find it on lean on, goes up, doesn't find it in dance hit song, prototype object, and then they all find it up here on the hit song constructor property that's on this hit song.prototype object. And that's because object create is just creating a regular object here and is using that as its prototype, and so we lose that that constructor property. But we can fix it, so let's go ahead and rewrite our code here to fix this and connect the chain. So this is the line that we've added to fix our code. We have dance hit song.prototype. We have the constructor property that we are then assigning to dance hit song. And we can see down here in our code, now hit song is constructor property. It's correctly labeled here. We have dance hit song prototype constructor property. That's correctly labeled here. And then lean on, the constructor for lean on, is correctly connected to dance hit song, and we can see true that the dance hit song.prototype object does have its own property for constructor. So now let's real quick, in a little more linear fashion, just go ahead and get another subtype with the rock hit song, and then one of the resulting hit song objects down here. And I'll just try to go through this real quick with the code and the diagrams. We write our rock hit song constructor. We define our explicit execution context when rock hit song is going to call hit song. We use object create to create a new object and set that to the rock hit song.prototype property, which effectively erases this constructor there. We repair the constructor relationship by adding the constructor property back and assigning it to rock hit song. Then we add the behaviors that we want to our rock hit song prototype object, so that way any rock hit songs that we create can access the behaviors in this rock hit song prototype object. And lastly, we use our constructor prototype relationships and inheritance that we've built to start cranking out the songs, to start cranking out the hits. So we use Born to be Wild, new rock hit song, and we already went up the chain with the dance hit song, so I'm not going to walk through it. But you can see that in this way we can mimic classical object-oriented programming ideas and methodologies with JavaScript constructors and prototypes. And this is called the pseudo-classical approach. Definitely pseudo. Once we get to ES6 classes, it's maybe slightly less pseudo, but this really is the foundation for even the ES6 classes is just syntactic sugar on top of this, which we'll walk through, but this is the foundation behind how all that's working. All right, so that's it for this video.